Terminators, let's get this going with another study review of Chapter 14 from Fast Track to a 5. We'll be going over World War I today. Now, here are the study guide questions you should have answered before we begin. And as we go through the video, can you please make sure to answer the checking for understanding videos questions because they are extra information that are not in your study guide. So let's talk about World War I and let's review from world history. Why did World War I begin? Well, basically, remember Maine. Now, they're not in the same order. You basically have nationalism. Love for your country turns to hate for your neighbors. What unifies French people is not just the fact they're French, but they hate the Germans and vice versa for the Germans. Militarism. Europe's not had a good war for a good 80 years or so. So they are glorifying war. They've forgotten what a good war is. The United States has seen what a good war is with the Civil War and seen lots of death, but Europeans have not. Also, if there's ever one of the most important reasons of why I believe this is Mr. Monica's reason for it beginning is imperialism, a race for countries in Africa and Asia. We just talked about imperialism. But why would you go to war in Europe over colonies in Africa? Why not go to Africa and fight over colonies in Africa? And the answer to that is because Africa does not own the colonies. It's England, France, and Germany that have a majority of the colonies in Africa. And if you go to war against one of the countries, if you win, to the victor goes the spoil. So for the Germans who are in last place for colonies, if they were to defeat France and England, Germany would get all of their colonies, and vice versa for France and England. If they defeat the Germans, they get the German colonies. And then lastly, do not forget you have alliances. Each country promised to protect each other. So you have in green on the map the Allies or the Triple Entente, which is essentially England, France, and Russia, and then other countries get involved as war goes on. And in purple there, you have the Central Powers, which are centered around Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, notice from these alliances, is there a major international power that's left out of these alliances? Identify it and explain why. And the answer is obviously the United States, right? Besides the fact that we believe in no permanent alliances from George Washington's farewell address and we stay out of European affairs, remember, this is a contest over colonies in Africa. And as we learned in the last imperialism unit, the United States does not need to conquer land for access to natural resources like in Africa. Our goal is islands in the Pacific and a gateway to Asia. So besides the fact that we don't get involved in European affairs, we don't need any of the land involved in Africa. Now, what's going to drag America into this war? What is the key reason why the U.S. actually ends up siding with England and France? Because actually, in a lot of ways, two of the largest immigrant groups in America are the Germans and the Irish. And in America, if we were to side with England and France, for a lot of Germans, we'd be attacking grandma. And if we were to side with England and France, if you were Irish, the Irish hate England and France. So you'd have a good third of the nation that does not support siding the Allies. But why did America side with England and France eventually? Well, basically, the key reason is America owned England and France billions of dollars. And if we were to get that money back, England and France needs to win. Also, we have closer ties to England as well. Also, they are our best friend. Now, three causes going to cause America to actually get involved in the war. This war begins in 1914, and for 3 years, the United States stays completely out of the war, neutral. Now, what's going to cause us to get involved? Well, number one is Germany starts a more intensive campaign of unlimited submarine warfare because the United States was sending supplies to England to help them win the war. The Germans didn't like that, and they had German U-boats sinking ships in North Atlantic seas. One example of that is the Lusitania. Even though it's not part of unlimited submarine warfare, it happens in 1915, and America gets so mad we go to war 2 years later. But by 1917, Germany is sinking not just English vessels in the North Atlantic, but American vessels. Another one is the Zimmermann Note. This is a proposed alliance between Mexico and Germany. And how does this change the U.S. position in regards to our belief of isolationism? It says no more isolationism. Well, because now it's our next door neighbor that actually might get involved in the war against us on the side of Germany. Germany promised New Mexico and Arizona if Germany wins. So rather than this being simply a European affair over Africa, colonies in Africa, it's now become a concern in our own backyard. And then lastly, you get the Russian Revolution. Russia is the big loser in this war. They lose about 3 million people in this war, and the people are so mad with the Tsar that basically the Tsar is overthrown and Russia surrenders in 1917 and turns into a communist nation. And what's going to happen now is Germany can take all those troops in Russia and they can send them over to the Western Front against France and England. And Germany is literally about to win this war. Now, the Allies, England and France, basically tell America, we need you to win this war. And America, we have to make excuse why it's okay to end this war, because keep this in mind about America's entry in World War I, and this is important. This is not a war for American sovereignty. If America loses this war, America loses nothing in this war. We're essentially fighting a war for England and France to get more land in Africa. But we can't say, hey, your son and daughter's dying for land in Africa. So what excuse can we now make with Russia out of the war? We can now say that the US is entering a war for democracy and freedom. Russia's out, Russia's communist. We don't like Russia, we don't like communism, but they have nothing to do with the war anymore. We're fighting on the side of England and France, democracies against Austria and Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, which all have kings or emperors. Right. And the US declares war in April 1917, and we get there ready to fight in May of 1918. So what happens in that time? Why does it take us over a year to get there? Well, basically, we have to get the country geared up to want to fight the war, right? And remember, this is not a war where America's sovereignty or independence is threatened. So we have to convince Americans that this is a good war, okay, or to support the war. And one of the things that gets passed is the Espionage Act and the Sedition Acts. And basically, the government makes laws that says that a person cannot speak out against the war, the president, or the government. It basically limits freedom of speech. Now, this Supreme Court case is very important. Schenck versus the United States. It states that the government can limit constitutional rights during a time of war to protect the country. Schenck was handing out anti-draft leaflets, basically saying that you're going to war for England and France to get more colonies in Africa. And he was arrested for that. And his excuse was, hey, but wait, can't I say fire in a crowded theater? That was what actually the court said, you can't say fire in a crowded theater. And Schenck said, actually, what if there is a fire? Now, also George Creel. Now, what did he foster? Right? Is he fostered the Committee of Public Information. Now, keep this in mind. This is the first time in American history that there's been a government propaganda agency designed to get American support World War I against evil. It's very propaganda is very similar to yellow journalism, but the difference here is yellow journalism was newspapers trying to sell newspapers by having sensational stories. That's always happened. That's part of freedom of speech. The difference here is now we have a government agency that is trying to brainwash Americans to support this war. Right now, why do you think the U.S. had to rely on such propaganda to get Americans to support this war? I've already gone it over again. Many Americans were against fighting in Europe. Besides the fact that U.S. sovereignty was not at risk, a lot of Americans are of German descent or of Irish descent, and they don't support the war. So we're trying to get all Americans on board with this, right? And a problem with this Committee of Public Information, it was successful. It did teach Americans to absolutely hate the Germans. Okay, if you look at the images up on above, right? Beat back the Hun, right? It's not Germans, the Huns. Okay, they're the group that just ransacked Rome. Okay, destroy this mad brute. The Germans are compared to gorillas, right? Second from the right, wake up, America. Civilization calls. What? The Germans aren't civilized? The country that brought us Mozart and Beethoven and Bach, they're not civilized. Only America's civilized, right? So the problem here is it actually did convince Americans to start hating Germans, including those in the United States. And when you think about it, should the government have the right to suppress liberties during a time of war and limit people's freedom of speech and force everybody to think the right way? Did the government have to go this far? And this question actually goes with Schenck versus the United States. And should a government have the right to suppress liberties? Yes, absolutely. If people's safety is being threatened, the government can limit what people's activities that they can do. We are living in it right now with COVID-19. The government's saying stay at home to stay safe so that less people get sick. So the government can make policies. But the question here with Schenck is, did the government have to go this far at this time? And the government's point of view would say, yes, we're trying to win a war, we're trying to protect our allies, hold back uh we're trying to hold back not communism, but totalitarian type governments. We're not even totally totalitarian type governments, but okay. But in a lot of ways, no, America did not have to, because this is a war of choice for America. We chose to get involved in the war. Now, the government has to increase its role in business. In order to win this war, we need to gear up in order to win this war, right? And what you want to understand is look at the complete transfer that's happened in the last 20 years since the beginning of progressivism, where the government's no longer laissez-faire. Under progressivism, the government was kind of getting involved in making regulations, and Wilson went further and broke up the monopolies. And now the government's totally involved in business with the War Industries Board. The government is actually telling businesses, we need you to produce this. So if you make women's shoes, you're now making combat boots. Now, were companies upset at the president's intrusion into the work, saying you can no longer make women's shoes, you have to make combat boots, or you no longer are going to grow corn, you're going to grow beans? And for a lot of Americans, it was no, because the whole point was the government's telling companies to make that so the government can buy it. So the government is the largest customer in the United States, and basically everything that a company can make, the government would buy. So keep this in mind, corporations and farmers profit a lot off of this war. And here's going to be a problem. The Lever Act and War Labor Board. While corporations were making money, the prices of goods went up because a lot of goods went to the soldiers, right? But a problem was the wages of the workers did not go up. So a lot of workers during World War I went on strike. So the Lever Act, the War Labor Board, gave the government the power to settle disputes between workers and businesses to ensure factories produced the needed goods, and it often sided against the workers. At the same time, while this is happening, two new groups are going to enter the workforce that in some ways will cause a disruption with the workers, but they're there to fix the shortage of labor due to the men going to the war, and that is going to be women. 1 million women enter the workforce, taking men's jobs because the men have gone to Europe, right? In that image above, you can see those women welding, and they're welding bombs. The other group are going to be African Americans or blacks. You get the Great Migration in the upper right hand corner. This is the time that blacks start to leave the South and move to more of the cities where they're able to get jobs they never had access to before. Now, when the war is over, there now has to be a decision about what's going to happen to Germany and how are we going to settle what was the biggest war in the history of the world. And you have the big four, and the big four countries are going to meet to decide the terms of post World War One world are going to be England, France, Italy, and the United States. America comes in the last 5 months of the war and essentially ends the war because we are a brand new country. We have all kinds of fresh troops, and we are able to push back the Germans. Now, the problem here is these four countries are going to decide the fate of Europe. But what countries that were involved in the war are left out that should have a say? And that's obviously going to be Germany and Russia. They're not invited to discuss peace, even though they're the two countries that lost the most people. And keep this in mind, these are the two countries that the United States is going to have the most problems with in the rest of the 20th century. There's going to be a bitterness because these countries were never allowed to participate in these discussions. And the provisions in the Treaty of Versailles that are going to hurt Germany are going to be one, Germany's going to be forced to pay reparations. So France wants repairs. They want money for damage in the war. Number two, a war guilt clause. Germany's going to take full blame for the war. Now think, is Germany to blame? Are they the only country to blame? And the answer is no. All countries wanted to go to war. All countries here wanted to get more land in Africa. That was basically their goal, which basically brings us to colonies. Germany loses all of its overseas colonies. And you can see in the map in the upper left there, the three tan countries, right, which would be Cameroon, Namibia, and Germany's Africa, right? Those are all German colonies. They go to England. So England has purple all through here and England here, and it also goes to France right there. Okay. Now, what are some key problems with this Treaty of Versailles? Do you think the Treaty of Versailles will lead to war in the future? Explain. The main key problem with the Treaty of Versailles is this: the causes of the war main are still left. They were never settled. There is still militarism. The only problem now is that Germany is limited on how many troops it can have. So there's an imbalance in military preparedness. France is strong, Germany is weak, does not make the Germans feel well. Alliances and imperialism. England and France are an alliance, and as an alliance, they basically take all of Germany's colonies. So there was a motivation to go to war for England and France, and this will lead the Germans in World War II being bitter about the fact, like, wow, well, if you guys took land before, we're going to go for land. And also nationalism. Germany is going to go into an economic depression, and Germany is going to be a shared spirit of complete devastation. And because all Germans are devastated, this becomes a breeding ground for fascism and the Nazis. Now, on the other side, Woodrow Wilson was coming over to Europe with the idea of trying to fix the problems in Europe. And he had his plan called the 14 points, right? And these are Wilson's plans for peace in Europe, right? The number one point of all of them is a League of Nations, an international committee to talk rather than fight. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot and all the countries went into declaring war against one each other again and again and again and again, if there had been an international committee where they all sit down and talk, maybe that could have avoided the war. Self-determination, create new countries in Europe that reflect nationalities. So the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is going to dissolve, and Austria will be its own country, Hungary will be its own country. But from that empire and the territories, you have a brand new country like Czechoslovakia for the Czechs and the Slovakians, and also a demilitarization to reduce militaries. And that's what happens to Germany, but not France. Also, he mentions fair treatment of colonial people. Now, keep this in mind. Wilson had 14 points, and not all 14 points. In fact, I think it was only 5 points were accepted in the Treaty of Versailles. So most of those points were ignored, but the League of Nations was accepted, right? And what ends up happening is the U.S. does not sign the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations, and the U.S. does not join the League of Nations. Now, the reason why is this. What happens is Wilson proposes the League of Nations in the 14 points, right? But in order for the treaty to be approved, you can see the upper right-hand corner, the person jumping through the window, the U.S. Senate has to ratify a treaty made by the President of the United States. The President just can't go in and say, this is my treaty, this is what America's going to do. The Senate has to support it, okay? And basically, America does not join because basically it punishes Germany, which is one, and there's a provision in it called Article 10. And in Article 10, right, this said that in the League of Nations, the President of the United States had the power to send the army in to protect any League member. The Senate thought this was an encroachment on their constitutional power of war declaring power, and they decided not to support it. Now, after World War I, a couple of things to keep in mind about America wanting to try to make peace and keep peace in the world because the war ended up being expensive. And one of those you just want to know is the five-power naval treaty. This is an attempt by the five largest naval powers, the United States, England, France, Germany, and Japan, right, to reduce their naval sizes because of to save money. I'm sorry, it was Italy, not Germany. Okay, another attempt to try to avoid war is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This is an attempt to outlaw war. It's signed by most all the major nations of the world, but the underlying problem with such an well-intentioned proposal is it's unenforceable. If Germany or the Nazis rise up and they want to go to war, you just can't write a letter to Hitler and say, Hitler, can you please not go to war? The only way to stop aggressors is with aggression. And then another attempt at peace for the United States is the good neighbor policy. And what the good neighbor policy is basically America says it's now going to treat Latin American countries well and stay out of their affairs. A good example of this was in Mexico when the Mexican government nationalized the oil industry. Mexico has lots of oil, and the oil was basically owned all by American companies. So the Mexican government basically took over all the oil wells in Mexico and renamed it Pemex, Petroleum Mexico. What did America do about the fact that their oil producing companies in Mexico were basically kicked out of Mexico? America did nothing. They said, hey, we're going to be a good neighbor. It's your country and your oil. And this was an attempt before World War II to make sure that Latin America did not side with the Nazis, right? Now, we'll keep this in mind. What are some examples of U.S. maltreatment towards Latin America that would make America have to change their mind? Well, keep this in mind. Before the good neighbor policy, right, there was 40 years of the bad neighbor policy. You had U.S. treatment of Latin America from President Roosevelt, which could be the big stick in our invasion of multiple sovereign nations in Latin America. Another one is Woodrow Wilson and his moral diplomacy, where Woodrow Wilson essentially almost went to war with Mexico before World War One because Mexico, in its civil war, was melting down in some ways. When Pancho Villa attacked a city in the United States, he was chased by American troops in Mexico. So the idea here is we're now going to change our attitude towards our Latin American countries to try to keep them on our side so they don't side with the Nazis. All right, guys. Thank you very much. Have a good day. And that's it for today.